Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for DP Solutions Cybersecurity Policies webinar. The webinar is slated to begin in about 1 minute, so we'll give people a chance to start logging in. Okay, if you're just joining us, this is DP Solutions Security Policies webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you again. My name is Jill Rose. I'm your moderator and the webinar organizer. Just wanted to start off with a few housekeeping notes. Everyone has been placed on mute just to cut down on any background noise. So if you do have any questions at all, you can use the question box to type them out during the presentation. We will take periodic breaks to answer your questions, and we'll also open up to a Q&A session at the end. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available for download on our website this afternoon. I will also email a copy of it out to everybody after the webinar. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's presenter, Mr. Ben Schmerler. He is DP Solutions Senior IT Risk Advisor. Ben, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jill, and thanks to everyone for attending today's webinar. We're going to talk today a little bit about how to create a successful cybersecurity policy, and I think this is a really important thing. Essentially, when we're talking about, hold on, move this around real quick. When we're talking about cybersecurity, there's a major focus for most organizations to implement technology and say, well, what stuff do I got to buy to make myself secure? What do I need to do to meet this standard? And there's certainly a lot of things you have to do, implement firewalls, have anti-malware. Sometimes you need to do logging and monitoring of those logs, backup procedures, disaster recovery, so on and so forth. But there's another piece of this, which is how you act and how you use your technology and the rights and expectations communicated to staff. Because essentially, we've created a sandbox with technology where people can do a lot of things. And even if you use all the sophisticated security tools, well, people can still either abuse their privilege, misuse their privileges, so on and so forth, which could create negative outcomes. So today, we're going to talk about how good policy management can help mitigate that and sort of the things you need to consider when developing a policy. Now, today when we go through this stuff, we're not going to be able to touch every aspect of policy management, but what I'm hoping to get at the end of this is to give you guys the baseline for which to work and to start developing your own policies and really, and if you already have one, reinforce it. So, as I said, true security combines technical security measures with strong policies. So we're saying all the technology we have, we're going to make those technologies even better by making sure the behaviors of staff and the policies we put in place make sense. Effective behavioral management will reduce risk as much as anything you can install on your network, perhaps more. Think about a ransomware attack that may come from a phishing exercise. So somebody sends an email to your entire staff, and it's got a bad attachment on it, and that attachment, once you open it up, installs some kind of payload, and all of a sudden your machines are infected. Or even if you've got proper antivirus, firewall, etc., that attachment opens up, and the software may or may not stop that attack from initiating. Wouldn't it be better if that email was just never opened because somebody recognized that we have a phishing attack taking place? More to the point, what if somebody is sharing their passwords within the office, and now somebody with elevated privileges can now, that person doesn't just, it's not really just that one person's rights, but everybody who has access to that person's account who has rights. We really need to control the behaviors of users in a reasonable way in order to mitigate the risks associated with this kind of unacceptable behavior. So today what we're going to cover is appropriate policies to implement. So just a sampling of various things that I think pretty much every organization should address in some way. Communications, training, and acknowledgement. So, there's definitely a lot of places that I've been involved with where you come in and you look at their policies, and the policies are good, right? They're written well, they're well thought out, they cover a variety of risk factors, they speak to practical concerns, they actually have a real exercise to them when it comes to how these policies are going to be implemented and run in practice, but nobody actually knows them. Management hasn't reviewed it. Staff has not acknowledged it. It's a really good book that nobody read. And then we're going to go into questions and answers. There's probably a lot of practical concerns here with meeting your own policy stuff, so we'll get into that. The first policy I want to talk about, and it's an extremely important one, is the acceptable use policy. Essentially, the rules that govern what people are allowed to use with technology they have. Essentially, it's designed to restrict the use of technology for, in particular, anything that touches an organization's data. We're saying here, hey, you've been given the keys to the car. Here are the rules, right? When you give a kid get their driver's license, they get their car, you don't just give them the keys. You say, hey, you have to use your seatbelt, you have to drive the speed limit, you can't drink and drive, you have to obey traffic laws, so on and so forth. Acceptable use policy is like those traffic laws. It shouldn't just define how technology can't be used, but also how it should be used, right? We share this sensitive data with this third party because they're a business partner with us and they have the right to have access to this data, right? We're creating the rules both for and against the use of technology. It should also explain why these rules are important, because essentially, in the end, we're trying to create a culture of compliance. So people should buy into these rules. They shouldn't just they shouldn't dismiss acceptable use rules because they think it's a bunch of stuck up policies and procedures that management came up with to give them a hard time, to make things harder on themselves or to control them. This is really supposed to be less about control and more about A, being productive with your technology, but B, avoiding the risks associated with it, right? If staff members understand, hey, we're an organization that needs to meet PCI compliance because we store a lot of credit cards at rest or whatever. So it's really important that you don't submit these documents and this server via email to third parties. That's forbidden, right? And we're explaining, well, because we're a compliance organization and because there's liabilities to us as an organization, this is why you have to act responsibly. We're not just making this up. We're not just trying to make things difficult for you. There's a method to the madness here, and you should want to be compliant. We want people to buy into the policy. And of course, with any kind of policy that defines acceptable use, or any policy, not just acceptable use, there should be acknowledgement at the end where staff says, hey, I've seen this policy, it makes sense to me, I know where what technology I'm allowed to use, where I'm allowed to use it, what standards I'm allowed to meet, what websites I'm allowed to visit, what I'm not allowed to do, all this stuff. And then you say, okay, you've acknowledged it, you've signed off, you've agreed to the terms, here's the keys to the car, you can go ahead and start your work now. A lot of times this happens after the fact, and by then the damage may already have been done. So these policies can include some rules for things like web browsing, which I alluded to a moment ago. Installing applications, in general, it is best to limit application installation to IT support, or maybe, an elevated user on site, someone with real authority to allow these sorts of things. It should also talk about acknowledgments for this stuff. So it's not just that, for example, let's say you're using DP Solutions for your IT support and you have a staff member who wants to install, Google Earth on their machine for whatever reason. And they reach out to us. Well, really, it shouldn't just be that staff members should be able to call up and say install this application. There should be a procedure for installing applications. That installation is approved by so-and-so manager, who then communicates to DP Solutions. Whatever the rules we want to create are, these things should be defined in acceptable use for installation. Sharing information. We should define specifically what information is important to the organization, why that information is sensitive, any liabilities the organization has when it pertains to that data. We are a medical practice, and as such we're subject to HIPAA compliance, and we need to protect this EPHI because all of this regulatory stuff. And as such, when we transmit this information to a third party, we are encrypting it in transit. We're only using these specific communications tools to send them. You can't send them via, let's say, a text message from your personal cell phone, or you can't put it on your personal Google Drive account and transfer it that way. You can't do stuff like that. These are the rules, and these are the secure paths that we've created for you to do that kind of sharing. It should also define who that information is allowed to be shared with, because otherwise, if there could be a request coming from somebody and they could be, quote unquote, sharing that data, quote unquote, securely by using, say, some kind of encrypted path to share that data, but it's for a totally unauthorized user and we've already violated policy. It doesn't matter that the technical security is good because we've created our own breach. So it really is important that we define sharing information rules. And then, of course, what a violation would represent. Now, I'm not an attorney. I can't speak to what you're allowed to say specifically in terms of punishments, but it should be clear that these rules are to be taken seriously, and if it's found that people are in violation of them, there will be consequences. Maybe that's just a discussion or a warning or acknowledgement in certain cases, but obviously serious violations of acceptable use policies, for example, copying a client database and taking it off-site and sharing it with somebody who's not authorized to it, is a serious offense, and that would be reviewed by management. I alluded to this a little bit before, but let's pivot to the sensitive data policy. This is really a really important one if you are in a compliance-minded organization that has to meet any kind of security standards. And I would say if you're into government contracting, financial services, healthcare, accounting, personal, anything dealing with what I call personally identifiable information, or PII is a very popular acronym, you really need to have a sensitive data policy. I mean, even broader than that, I think any organization that has some expectation that information is private and that they don't want their information to get out there needs to come up with a policy that defines this stuff. So what does it define? It says what sensitive data actually is to the organization, and that can vary, right? So for DP Solutions, for example, we have a lot of information we publicize on our websites, right? We have cut sheets that we share with clients, marketing materials, information about staff. I mean, you can see my picture on the website and stuff like that. That information really wouldn't be considered sensitive, right? We're publicizing that. If somebody sends a picture of me and Ben's webinar on April 25th to 100 people on their list, they haven't violated any policies because that's not sensitive data. This is public information versus, say, the HR-related information on Ben Schmerler, like Ben Schmerler's social security number, or Ben Schmerler's pay information, or what have you. DP Solutions internally defines what information is supposed to be sensitive and what isn't. You have to kind of do that too. And sometimes this information is internal. It could be, again, that HR type information or trade secrets. This is just information that we don't share with others because it's too valuable of a commodity for us to allow someone to see it. It could be anything subject to privacy rules or privacy laws. It could be, credit card information. Obviously, these things become pretty obvious once you start breaking it down. It should also define where this sensitive data should be stored. Specifically, company assets, company technology assets like servers or databases that are centrally managed, where that information can be backed up, so on and so forth. And it should be clear that people shouldn't be using personal devices to store sensitive data. It should be clear that, for the most part, I mean, I understand that there's some workflow concerns, but we really generally discourage people from storing information on say, the company issued laptop that they travel with. If possible, you want to store that data somewhere and just use the laptop to access that information and manipulate it before it gets put back into the virtual file closet, if you will. We should really be very clear to staff where that information is supposed to be stored at rest. We should also talk about what the backup procedures and other things that are done to ensure the integrity and privacy of data. Now, for the average user, they don't mess with the backups, right? It doesn't matter to them where the patient records for the healthcare practice are being stored and how those backups work and all that. The person doing working the front desk isn't generally involved in that, but we should make it clear what our backup procedures are, so there's an expectation for staff. More importantly, if anyone ever wants to look and see that the organization has come up with a plan, a data management plan, where we've defined what data is important to us, where that data belongs, what the backup procedures are, and why those backup procedures were put in place, we have a document saying what that logic was. And not only that, if we ever have to adjust any of these policies, acceptable use, sensitive data, or any of the other things we're going to talk about today, we want to sort of build that logic into the policy so that when it comes time to review it, update it, change it, which is sort of something with policy that's always going to happen, that we sort of have a baseline to work with, and that no matter what changes we make to the goals and to the actual policy itself, that the spirit of the goals and objectives that were defined in the original policies are preserved. It should also define the expectations for staff use of sensitive data, including sharing rules and procedures. We talked about that a little bit before. So here's who's allowed to access it. Here's who's not allowed to access it. Here's the limits of that, etc. Mobile personal devices. This is very much overlooked, I find, in many organizations that I've worked with, which is, we create all these wonderful ways for people to work remotely and have their, for example, their personal iPhone connect to a company email or the Dropbox folder, or they work from home one day a week and they use their own desktop that sits in their living room to access information. Well, now those personal devices have to be considered as part of a security plan, because if data is being brought to a device that's personal and then that device is compromised, that company's asset, that data, could then be taken, and you could have a data breach on your hands. What makes this extra difficult is the fact that there's no central enforcement of rules on these devices. Typically, we can't say a PC that somebody bought at Best Buy that doesn't have all the tools that were installed on the one that was issued by the company is going to get these specific security tools. So we have to tell people, if you're going to use your personal device, this is what you got to do with it. So anyway, mobile device, personal device policy. So we should first have some documentation of what personal devices access the data. I always recommend to people, hey, it's great that you have personal devices accessing it. Maybe we should define what those devices are. We shouldn't have unlimited, unaccounted for devices accessing the system. We should say, hey, if you're working from home, this is the device that you use. Ben Schmerler has a laptop that he uses to work remotely, and he does email and writes reports on it and does phishing tests or whatever. And that's what he does with it. And that means that Ben Schmerler, when he goes to a hotel on his vacation, doesn't use the PC sitting in the hotel that we have no idea what the security is on to go ahead and file very sensitive reports that could represent a data breach. We don't want any of that stuff. We need to define upfront specifically what devices we're allowing and what we're not allowing. If there's any sort of forced security tools implemented on these devices, for example, a lot of mobile devices, cell phones, Android phones, iPhones, etc., can be joined to what's called a mobile device management system. And these mobile device management systems will create rules and security tools. So, for example, when I signed up for company email, I opted into having a password on my phone so that I couldn't just swipe up and access all the company information without any security on it. We agreed to, say, wipe the phone for that company email. If I decided to quit one day, the company could use that tool to blow away the email, and now I don't have access to company information anymore. We should be clear to staff, hey, it's okay if you use your cell phone, but hey, we're putting a few rules and tools on this to enforce that, and be completely transparent about it. Additionally, you should describe any rights you give up by using a personal device. Now, this is a fine line here, because people are allowed to use their personal cell phones to take family pictures or go to Twitter or Facebook or whatever. I mean, this is why people get cell phones most of the time. But at the same time, once you start putting company information on it, the company or the organization is liable for, now we have to start saying to people, well, that's fine that you're doing that, but now you can't just make it so that the phone has no password. We are forcing you to have a password. And if the employee is not comfortable with those rules, well, then that's fine. That personal device is not allowed to access company data. We have to make a choice here. Either the employee agrees to the rules in which company data is accessed or organization data is accessed, or they're not using that device, period. And it doesn't have to be, a conflict or an argument or anything like that. These are just basic, easy to follow rules. I mentioned the kiosk computers, public networks, et cetera. We should define those rules. When it comes to mobile personal device use, we're not looking for terribly crazy rules on these devices. Just the basic stuff that we would expect to have on company devices, that it requires a unique username and password, that access to that data is limited to the authorized staff person, that it's getting patches and updates regularly, that doesn't have application bloat, that it's getting virus scans, all the things that we should be doing to make that device reasonably secure. Oh, and that it's a supportable device, right? So you can't use your Windows 2000 PC to access information today because Windows 2000 isn't supported by Microsoft anymore. One policy that I'd like to touch on, and this is kind of a newer one, is social media, and I'm sort of bundling an email because I feel like this kind of started with like company email policies, and now it's the same rules are kind of being extended to social media. What makes social media very interesting is that it has a lot of the same sort of pratfalls that, say, smartphones have, which is that they have this weird mix of personal and company expectations. I have people, I have various social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, so on and so forth, and these are great, but I definitely get people who, on accounts that I keep more personal, who want to contact me for business, and, for example, LinkedIn, which is totally a business, type of social media account, I get personal people contacting me on, well, there should be, this is just the way the world is now, but at the same time, we should make an expectation of what people are allowed to do with social media. So you want to restrict users to only post company information that would otherwise be publicly available and not consider a part of the sensitive data policy. I consider my Facebook, for example, to be a private account, a personal account. I don't go on Facebook and post HIPAA articles or do sort of business networking or some of the other things that people might do with a social media account. I guess I just want to leave it to pictures of my cats and other goofy stuff that I do with Facebook, right? So as such, I limit it to that. But it's okay if I go on Facebook and say, hey, I wrote this blog for this site, check it out, right? This is all public information. Who cares if that mixes the private with the personal? We have no real data breach expectation. On the other hand, some of these social media things, again, getting to LinkedIn, are very collaborative in nature. And you can understand how people might arrange meetings about company stuff on LinkedIn. We just have to define what that is. Again, it's just defining in policy what the expectations are. We should also define any special technology associated with things like email, such as email encryption, when it should be used. So if we are using company email or just email in general, and somebody wants to send something off, they should understand what that send secure button that encrypts an email does, when we use it and when we don't use it. And we should also make it clear what's allowed to be done with a personal email account versus a company email account. These, again, when you break it down and you start thinking about these policies, a lot of this makes sense. You need to go back as a manager and think, what are the logical rules I want to establish? What are the goals I'm looking to achieve? Don't think about the tech, just think about the logic behind it. What are the outcomes I want for my personnel when it comes to privacy management, technology management, sensitive data, acceptable use, et cetera? What are the things I would like to see? And then all of the policy stuff is defined around that, as well as the tools you use to enforce it. We should also include some comments with social media and email policies that speak to how phishing and social engineering can be used to exploit the organization. I bring that up as a special one because phishing and social engineering is a major vector of attacks now. If I can send an email to 1 million people and get a few people to bite on it, that tricks them into volunteering, say, a username and password into a system. One of those emails that says, "Oh, I'm Microsoft and I forgot your username and password. Please confirm your login and click here," or whatever, which is a very typical type of phishing or social engineering attack. We should speak to this specific threat because it's an easy to perform attack. It's cheap. It's a significant source of damage now. And I think social media and email policy should talk specifically about phishing and social engineering. There are a variety of resources available on the internet that give you good talking points. I'm, of course, happy to talk with you more about it. We actually do phishing testing here at DPS for our clients. But I think it deserves a special carve-out in policy now, given where we are in 2018. Another one we're going to talk about briefly is it was what I would call an incident/disaster policy, and I call it incident/disaster because I think incidents and disasters are a little different. It's a broad and often lengthy policy that covers how the organization handles incidents or disasters. Essentially, we're saying, hey, we've run into something that's a problem, and that problem could be as mundane as a PC failing. I just came in and the machine won't power on, and it turns out the power supply is dead. This is an incident we have to deal with. Obviously, an incident such as that is not a sort of end of the world thing most of the time. It's usually a pretty cut and dry thing. We have to have a procedure for replacing the device in short order and get the person back up and running. But what an incident isn't is all hands on deck, catastrophe. We're communicating with third parties. We have to worry about liability, so on and so forth. A disaster, on the other hand, I would say is much more serious. We have to work in another site. Our entire system has been compromised. We're worried about a data breach. We have to restore all of our data. These major things that are going to impact really almost everyone in the organization and potentially people outside of the organization. It should establish an incident response team. So an incident response team are basically it's a combined group of people. Some of it is internal staff, the people who are handling the communication and management in the middle of an incident. They're the people who report to IT support about the nature of the incident and what's expected. They're communicating with staff about where they should be working, the status of resolution. They're going to be the ones who do post-incident remediation and review to make sure that whatever caused that issue is maybe reasonably addressed in the future, if it can be. So on and so forth. Basically, we're creating our group of people who snap into action should something happen. As I mentioned, it should define what constitutes an incident and relative levels of incident. So I don't think this needs to be too specific, but ultimately we want the heads of the incident response team to be the ones who flip the switch from incident to disaster and say, these are the general guidelines we use to determine when something needs to be elevated to disaster. It should revisit the technology used to mitigate and remediate incidents. So I always say it's a good time to, again, even though the people who are dealing with this policy oftentimes aren't the ones managing the technology, it's good to define what that is. We have a quick recovery solution for this server that will recover our server in an hour, and it will return us to a restore point from as much as 6 hours before, or whatever those items are. And it explains what the actual expectations are if we need to get into some sort of significant recovery. So that when somebody wants to understand, well, how long are you going to be down for, the incident and disaster policy should speak to some expectations of how something like this might go. Now, granted, it's impossible to know exactly how long a disaster recovery will take, to the minute until we're actually doing it. But there are general metrics we can do to determine how long that's going to take and what it's going to take. It's also a good opportunity when you're defining this stuff to define why the technology is the way it is. We have a disaster recovery solution, and we can only recover from 12 o'clock or from midnight last night because the data is so complex and the system is this way, and that's the best solution we can come up with. Or, the budget allows us to do this kind of solution. Anything more, we would have gotten maybe a 50% improvement on recovery time, but it would have cost us 10 times as much, and we just don't think it's worth it as an organization. We did a risk management process. Essentially, what we're trying to show if anyone ever looks at this incident or disaster policy, again, or any of these policies that we're talking about today, we want to prove to the person reviewing it that we've performed due diligence and that these policies aren't just made up, that they're based on real risk factors and real thought. It should also talk about what happens after an incident is remediated. So we found a virus, we fixed it, we restored from a backup, we recovered the servers, we worked offsite, we brought it back home, we did all the stuff we need to, we're back to operational normalcy, and now what do we do? How do we look at this incident and figure out if there's something else that needs to happen later? We should just basically say, hey, within, say, a week, we are going to revisit a major incident and determine if anything could be done better to make the outcomes that much better. Maybe this may involve, in the case of certain like cyber attacks, something like forensics. You know, if we need to go back and determine how an attack happened or what needs to happen. Oh, I'm sorry, something just happened with my window. I apologize. Sorry, my thing just went away. Getting back to the incident response, you just want to be able to say, hey, we're not going to just say, well, the issue is fixed, let's not worry about it anymore. We want to prevent these issues from happening again in the future, if at all possible. We have network security policies. So this is a little more technical, but this should just define controls in place to mitigate risks and justify the investments made in technology to prove due diligence. We're basically, it's a documentation sheet essentially. So we're just going to go with the network security policy. And again, it's a pretty cut and dry, and this is something we can provide some guidance on, where we're just going to say, hey, we are using this kind of firewall. We do this kind of maintenance. Our hardware is in a supportable state. We review it every year. All of the things we do, we're basically putting up a laundry list of things we do to protect things from active attackers and active threats. You don't have to overthink it. But again, what we're trying to really demonstrate is due diligence. In case someone comes in and says, what are you doing for network security? That we're not just saying, well, you know, I think our IT support company does something. You actually have to define for yourself what you're doing and why that determination was made. Other policies to consider. So physical security. Obviously, if you have significant assets in a space, and you don't want somebody being able to walk into your server closet, popping hard drives out, taking them with them, and doing a data breach. You should define what your physical security is, how it's inspected, so on and so forth. That can be often overlooked. You may have to make a statement on a specific compliance standard. So depending on what standards you have to meet, the policies and procedures needed need to be very specific. So, like for example, if you're talking about sensitive data policies, you really should speak specifically to EPHI for HIPAA if you're a medical practice or some kind of covered entity. If you are a PCI compliant organization that needs to meet the credit card industry standards, you should speak to that specifically. And you don't have, if you have existing policies that speak to the goals of PCI or HIPAA or FINRA or any of these other standards, I think just saying we have recognized that we have to be compliant to these other standards is maybe a better way of going about it than reinventing all of your existing policies to fit HIPAA. A lot of the times when people develop good policies, they already meet the standards that these compliance lists have. We just want to make it clear that we understand what we're legally obligated to do. There should be definitely, for pretty much every organization, security awareness and training policies saying that employees have been taught about recent threats that are out there, the things they need to look out for. These are the trainings we put them through in order to get access to our systems and handle sensitive data. We should be defining that, because if people act, it's one thing if people make mistakes, but we don't want those mistakes to happen because nobody taught somebody how to do it better. And oftentimes, just illuminating people with the idea of what phishing is can avoid a phishing attack. It's so important that we create a security awareness and training platform and define that in policy. There should be employee onboarding policies in general, background checks. I know for DFARS compliance, there's a lot of focus on, background checks, et cetera. user training, security awareness, so on and so forth. Any kind of wireless or guest access policies, people come into an office, they want to access the network. Okay, cool. You want to go browse internet, that's fine. It should be done on a distinctly different network than the sensitive data. Similarly, there should be rules about what it is, what the password is, who's allowed to have access to this stuff, etc. Or you could just ban it and say, hey, you know what, our Wi-Fi belongs to us. Nobody else is allowed to get onto it. And so therefore, wireless and guest access is just not allowed, period, end of story. Non-disclosure policies, you're not allowed to share this information with other people. I don't think I need to get too far into that. Very important, media and technology destruction policies. I think a lot of people recognize the idea that when you delete something off a hard drive, you click on that file and you shift-click delete, which is the way to do it so it doesn't even go to the recycle bin, that data sort of still exists on that hard drive. That if you're sophisticated enough, you can go hook that drive up and pull data that was quote-unquote deleted. So as a result, a lot of organizations, when they decommission PCs or servers or whatever, they want to destroy hard drives. That's great and all, but we should create a policy regarding that and say, this is how we destroy these drives. These are the vendors we work with to destroy those drives, and any compliance standards that they have to meet, like a shredding company, for example, that is doing shredding, pardon me, a shredding company can't just go in and take all your medical records and rip them up. They have to provide some assurances that they're not just taking those records and reading through them and taking the data and committing fraud. So you have to sort of define things that way too. Furthermore, you really shouldn't be doing things like, well, I removed this hard drive and I smashed it on the ground and threw it in the garbage. You need to have an actual procedure where there's documentation that media that had sensitive data on it was destroyed in a responsible way so that this data is 100% for sure inaccessible. A drive that is destroyed by a professional shredding company where that data is cut into a million pieces and is totally unreadable is a 100% foolproof way for that data not to be read. I dealt with a client recently that told me that they pulled a drive out and they took a drill and they drilled a hole through it and they said, well, the data's not readable, right? And I go, I don't know. I mean, this is you going to Home Depot and breaking a drive yourself doesn't exactly fill me with assurance that this data is sufficiently destroyed. So important before we move to questions to talk about documentation, communication, and management. So we need to determine how the team will best digest this information. We want to make sure they acknowledge and understand it. So everything needs to be simple and high level. It needs to be understandable for the end user. Specifics about how technology works or what level of encryption you're using or how Office 365 was set up or any of these other things that we're defining in these policies. If somebody wants to know the level of encryption we're using, they can follow up on our policy to determine more about that. If somebody wants to know how we came up with our list of sensitive data assets, we could describe that. We don't have to get into a revisit of everything we've done to assess up to this point. We want to make this understandable for the layperson who comes in and doesn't know anything about our organization. We want to communicate a philosophy, but don't be too prescriptive. So the philosophy is we want to protect our data, we want to keep things secure, but we don't necessarily need to draw very specific lines of definition for this stuff because technology in and of itself is changing, is just an ever-changing thing. We don't want people to not do productive things simply because they're afraid it wasn't specifically defined in policy. It should really say, if you're not sure of what you should do, here are the people you can communicate with to find out the answers to that question. So that if something is maybe not properly illustrated in policy because we haven't thought about it yet or it's a new challenge or whatever, at least we know who to communicate with so we can improve our policies and at least show that we've thought about things before acting on them. There should be some sort of, I usually recommend annual acknowledgement of policy, and before any staff starts touching assets, we alluded to that earlier. And there has to be from management, in particular the incident response team when it comes to disaster policies, that these policies are reviewed regularly for adherence and updating. I usually recommend annually at minimum. And if you're going to make a big organizational change. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you move your offices completely. You double in size. You replace all of your servers. You have a new core database application that your data is now going into. When those wholesale changes occur, that's really the time that policy needs to be revisited to make sure that the policies and rules that you set up still make sense. Because a disaster recovery policy, for example, that made sense when you had all of your servers in-house may not make sense anymore when all of those servers are now based on a software as a service model or hosted in Amazon or Microsoft Azure or something like that. The policies need to fit the technology you're using, not the technology you had. Employee adherence. Employee adherence. Some tech tools can help. Again, mobile device management makes personal device management easy. Data loss prevention is the type of tool that says, hey, a good example is Office 365. For certain subscriptions, you can say, hey, anything with a social security number, you can't email out. We're making it as a rule. So they can't violate that policy. If you say SSNs are forbidden to be emailed, well, you can create a DLP policy that forces that, so that even if somebody wants to or doesn't read the policy, that can be done anyway. Sometimes it's tricky to set those things up, and it may not be applicable in all cases, but it's nice to have those sorts of technical tools to enforce adherence. Web filtering and monitoring is obviously a solution that most have, but I have to tell you that there's really no substitute for a strong culture of compliance. We can buy a lot of technology tools out there that will marginally improve security, but good behaviors really cost a lot less and improve outcomes a lot more. Not only that, a culture of compliance where people want to do the right things will prevent people from making the behavioral mistakes that no technology can address. We should advertise policy with regular updates. So, hey, just a reminder that we're a HIPAA compliant organization, so on and so forth. And violations should be clear. So in summary, we want policies to define both the technology and the expectations for staff behavior. These policies have to be reviewed, updated, and they have to be ensured that staff has acknowledged them and understand what they mean and why they matter. And poor policy management basically can undermine technology solutions designed to limit risks. There is no backup solution in place that can recover your data for data that was not backed up to the place that the backup was designed to back up. So somebody who creates sensitive data or is managing sensitive data and they're touching it on their laptop and they never stored on a server where the backup was created to back up, we can't recover that data when that laptop is lost. It just can't be done. So the technology is great, but the policy management was lacking in those sorts of examples. I really strongly believe that policy management is maybe the best return of investment that an organization can implement when it comes to risk reduction. Technology will always be imperfect. There are flaws in technology that we don't know about yet. It's sort of a numbers game, right? I mean, there's a million things that could go wrong with Windows or a PC or a server or anything like that. And there's always something that someone can exploit. The idea that we're going to address all technology risks simply by buying stuff is false. So it's important that we use policy to really reduce risk so that the technology is like a nice warm blanket around our policy, right? That we expect our staff to do the right things and that the technology is only something to guide them. It's almost like having a nice pair of sneakers, right? You're going to go out and you want to get fit and you have to hit the gym every day and run and all this stuff, but we're getting the nice shoes to make it easy to do these things. But at the same time, we still have to do the running. We still have to do the work of policy management. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and we'll move on to questions. I know I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to take a quick drink from my coffee. And Jill, if you got any questions for me, I'm happy to take some.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, as a reminder, if you have any questions, you can type them in the question dialog box, or you can click the raise hand button and we can unmute you to ask your question. So it does look like we have a question coming in, Ben. Are there any types of information that are more of a concern to keep private than others?
That's going to depend on the organization. So obviously, the first thing I would focus on when you're talking about data is anything that you're legally obligated to protect. If you control patient health information, financial information, credit card information, anything now with the European Union with GDPR, the greater data, or I'm sorry, the General Data Protection Regulation, I believe. Obviously, those things sort of move to the top of prioritization because we have a legal obligation to protect this stuff, and we could face fines. We might not be able to do business the way we used to, so on and so forth. But you can't just limit it to that stuff. You have to focus on other stuff too, like you know, DPS wouldn't want information to get out there about our clients' systems. You know, what stuff our clients have. We don't want our price sheets and stuff like that getting out there. Granted, no one's going to sue us if our business information gets out there, but we're going to have egg on our face. We're not going to look good. So that should be defined in those policies, and we should treat them pretty much as important as we would for legally obligated information.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. And another question coming in. Who in the organization should be involved in creating the policies?
There should be several people. I mean, obviously it starts with upper level management, you know, the decision maker types, those who ultimately have the authority to make the decisions to do these things. But I would say that it's not something that you can really do alone, right? So the person creating the policy needs to involve the various parties. So I would say HR is often involved with this stuff. The principals of an organization. Oftentimes, when it comes to the technology policies, you really need to have somebody who's familiar with the technology in place, an IT person, someone like, you know, if you're working with us, someone like DPS probably needs to be involved to clarify points about what you have and why it's done this way. You should also perhaps bring in third parties that you work with. Let's say you are in some kind of business where you're transferring money to a third party all the time and it's a part of your important business and it's secure and all that, you know, you've created good technology around it. It's still important that those people be involved in disaster planning or policy management. They need to know that in the event of a disaster, you may have to work with them a little bit differently. So they should be involved in the policy too. So while one person kind of has to drive it, and that person's usually upper level management, that person has to have the understanding that this is not a one-man show. They will have to get a lot of people involved so that the policy is robust enough to address a variety of risk concerns.
Great, excellent. Okay, we have another question coming in. Are there policies available in the public domain to use as a framework for writing each of the different policies, or companies that can help create policies based on the business?
Yes, yes, and yes. So one of the things I do for clients is I help them develop policy. You know, sometimes I do a lot of the writing, which is, and if I do that sort of stuff, I usually say, well, we have to start with sort of a workflow thing. You know, it's not fair for me to just write policy for an organization without knowing the organization. But if you want to do it yourself, there's a ton of resources out there that I sometimes use when I'm developing policy, such as templates. Just which could be as simple as things in Microsoft Word that are just like policy frameworks. And when I say framework, I don't mean actual content, but like formatting for these documents to make it easy for you to sort of fill in the blanks. There's the SANS Institute, which provides a lot of public domain templates and section type things where it'll say, well, here's a disaster policy and here are the various sections you need to include. It doesn't include the content, but it gives you an idea of what you need to put in. I should also point out that there are a number of other just available things that you can Google search for with this stuff, but the policy is really going to vary from person to person and organization to organization. As you might expect, Amazon probably has to have a pretty sophisticated disaster policy because they manage, I don't know how many thousands of servers in their cloud. So their disaster policy has to be pretty sophisticated. And it's probably not going to surprise you that the organization that has 2 servers and a network closet somewhere with 1 office probably doesn't need the level of disaster policy that Amazon does. So these things are going to vary up a little bit as well.
Okay, great. I hope that answers your question. And I think that's all the questions we have for now. I don't see any more coming in.
Great. Thanks so much for everybody attending. I hope this was informative. If you'd like to follow up on this, maybe you have some specific questions you don't want to share on the webinar, or you want to learn more about some of the various subjects, have any kind of offline discussion. Obviously I can only get into the questions so much on the call, but my contact information is here. As always, feel free to reach out to us on this or any other security or risk management concerns. We've been doing webinars every month to talk about various subjects, and we look forward to future webinars with you guys.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.